I recently came across this interview by the guys over at Triggernometry, and an interview that they did with Adam Carolla, a comedian and an actor, right? And I was watching the video, and it seemed to sort of encapsulate everything that or in large part, what we've been discussing here on the channel, and I thought it would make for a good discussion. But while the interview itself was sort of a bit broader in scope, I still think it does have wider implications, or at the very least, implications on modern storytelling. And there was enough of an overlap in what we have discussed here on the channel before that I thought this would add to the conversation. We're going to go through that video um, and just discuss some of the points that Adam himself raises. I believe the guys at Trigonometry do, after the interview that they do with their host, they would then pose a question to them at the end of the discussion about things that are not being talked about that they feel should be discussed. And one topic that Adam brings up is what he calls Gynofascism, right? Which I think we could have gotten by with just saying feminism. I'm not sure why he chose this term, but it is an interesting conversation. So let's check it out.
What's the one thing we're not talking about that we should be?
Gynofascism. Figured you'd make that look. It's something I've been thinking about a lot over the last 20 years. Like, we need more women in positions of power. We
Yeah.
need more women making the calls and calling the shots. We need a woman president.
That
We need a
has
woman
been the
prime minister.
protocol.
We need more feminine presence, everywhere. And LA is mostly women, city council. We have a female mayor, and we don't get anything done. And I started to really think about there's a difference between the male brain and the female brain. And the male brain wants to do.
Right. I'm just going to pause there for a moment, right? That is something that I've mentioned a few times on the channel as well. And before I even get into that, it's refreshing to hear. I feel he sort of gets away with it because, in large part, as a comedian, you sort of have, well, perhaps not so much anymore, but you sort of had free reign to speak without a filter, right? But given the state of comedy as it is today, I suppose he's still taking some amount of risk that there could be some backlash or some pushback against what he said here, but he's still choosing to do it nonetheless. I think for him, not to take away from what he's doing or saying, but he already has an established career, or he's doing his own thing now, so he's less worried about the Hollywood machine and what the implications may be for his career, should he say this. I do wish we had more, that I don't particularly even want a world where we are relying on celebrities for moral grounding, but I do wish people would have a spine, more or less, particularly when they're in that early part of their career where their words tend to mean a lot more because they're in the public, in the public limelight, um, rather than waiting until they're at the end of it to sort of, well, after the damage has already been done, and that's when this is being highlighted. I'm not sure. Perhaps he has done this throughout his career. From what I have seen or heard of him, he's usually a very direct individual. But again, he's a comedian, so it may be that this is something that he has been speaking about for years, and no one has listened, right? But it is interesting to hear him speak about the differences in how women think versus how men think. And this is something that, this is not new science, right? The studies for this distinction has been relevant for decades now, but it's something that we've chosen to overlook. And I think in large part that is we can attribute that to what he we'll discuss in this video, which is that we're more concerned now with optics and how things may be perceived versus how they actually are. And that is in large part the feminized society that we have unfortunately arrived at. But we'll allow him to continue, and I'll get back to that momentarily. All right.
Stuff like go, go, go. Like if you want to know the difference between the male brain and the female brain, Karen Bass and Donald Trump got together 3 days after the fires, and Donald Trump was like, let's get going. Move. Clean up those lots. Let's get building.
Taking action.
Like, slow it down. Slow it down. She is a process person, and women are more likely to be process people. They talk, they want to talk it out, they want to work, they want to have a meeting, and they want to break off and have another meeting, and then want to put together.
Exactly this, right? I said earlier in the video that one of the reasons I wanted to cover this is because while he's speaking more about policy issues, right? There are implications for other areas, right? Particularly for my channel, that I want to speak more along the lines of modern storytelling or storytelling in general, and how this Gynofascism has impacted storytelling. And we can look at that from several perspectives, whether it is the censorship, right? Tone policing, where there are certain things you're not allowed to write, or themes you're allowed to explore in your stories, or the literacy rate, which has dropped by 40% in the US, right? We quite literally have students leaving school unable to read. And that is in large part due to the feminized nature of the classroom that we have now established, where the male voice is no longer there to create that rigid foundation that's required for an education, for academia to lay that foundation. That is what is missing, and instead we've now focused more on how the students feel about about the experience, and how we can lower the standard or lower the bar so that they can feel better about that. And this is in fact very much it is about being process driven. One of the reasons why I mentioned it in the last video here, that women gravitate more towards these particular jobs, whether it's secretarial work, administrative, teaching, right? These are professions where they can be presented with a syllabus, and the process is already outlined for them, and so they can follow that to a T and complete these tasks. And in that video, I likened it to the memories that more often than not people have about these teachers who made a subject fun, like the science teacher who did this cool experiment. This is someone who would have been going off script, so to speak, right? But they recognize a need for the students to have a more practical approach to science, just as an example. And many of us have that vivid memory of that science teacher. And in large part, it's usually a male teacher that does this, because he tends to focus less so on the process itself and more, how can I improve this, right? How can I improve their understanding of this subject? And so he'll perform some sort of experiment to sort of wow the students and get them intrigued into what it is that they are learning. More often than not, that is a male teacher that does this, because women tend to follow the process, and men tend to sort of go against the grain and push boundaries, more often than not. Obviously, this puts us in trouble many of the times, right? Our penchant for going outside the norm, but it has both positives and negatives, right? And this is in one instance a positive, for education, and how this impacts literacy as we are seeing it now, a decline more or less, which is interesting because there are more women reading now more than ever, more so than men, and female authors, right? The publishing industry has for the large part been catering to women for the last several decades, and literacy is actually going down, not up. And again, this is because of the quality of the material that's being put out, because it is not challenging. It is more often than not softcore pornography for women that is being published, right? So there are implications there. While he's speaking about things that are more to do with policy and running and governing a city, but I feel this gynofascism that he speaks about is impacting all areas of society at the moment. But let's hear what what else he has to say here.
Blue ribbon panel. And so in LA, we have a homeless problem. And the homeless problem keeps getting worse every year.
Yes,
but we
worse
keep
and worse.
having more conversations and more panels and more groups, but it's mostly women and nothing ever gets enacted. And we are heading toward a society that used to be men, testosterone. And by the way, I'm not making this up. You're going to see more articles and stuff coming out that the feminine mind is different, and the feminine mind is also satiated by actually discussing the thing. So if we're sitting here and, you're going, we should take this and move this wall and do a thing. The feminine mind actually feels like we did something, whereas the male mind is like, we haven't done anything.
We haven't done
just
anything
keep
yet.
talking about this thing that we're not doing, and it's frustrating versus satiating. So,
and we recognize this. Again, these are things that have been very obvious for some time, but we've chosen to ignore it, right? We've all memed about the whole companies becoming an HR just cesspool, more or less. That is what it's really become. Just red tape for HR, which is only there to serve the needs of the women more often than not. And why that sort of, I think how I described it in the video was that everything just feels terrible, right? Like there's a dip in quality in everything that we're consuming. And a lot of that has to do with what is happening within the company itself, where a group of people will go into a meeting, and because the work environment itself has also become so feminized, everyone will have a meeting every other day of the week or every day of the week, and to talk about accomplishing one task or another, and then at the end of the meeting itself, no one is really on the same page as to what exactly it is that needs to actually be done. I've had several of these meetings myself, unfortunately, and I don't like to use anecdotal experiences, but clearly this is something that we can immediately, not just myself, but you can immediately recognize. You've experienced this yourself before, right? Where it does seem as though we're doing more talking than actually taking action. And we've had a slew of sort of marketing, how to define it, failure of marketing, to put it politely, right? With things like Bud Light and Cracker Barrel and so on, where these companies hire women to sort of rebrand themselves. And obviously, again, the first thing that a lot of these women tend to look at is some sort of social issue that is ongoing. They're not looking at how to improve the product itself that is being offered. It's all about just the optics and how this can be discussed and how it will be perceived, but not about actually improving the quality of the product or the customer's experience with the product. It's never anything tangible, right? It's purely just the euphoria of feeling that you have accomplished something by talking about this particular issue, whatever the hot button social topic happens to be at that particular moment. And they feel as though something has been accomplished there, when in truth nothing has.
the feminization is causing a huge shift in our culture. we just got crushed by COVID, especially in Los Angeles, because we had a female health director. And by the way, men can be stricken with this. Gavin Newsom's a pussy, and Eric Garcetti, our former mayor. Justin Trudeau thinks like a chick. You can tell, watch them cross their legs.
He makes a good argument here. And this isn't about bashing either of these men. I would actually add, Obama to that list that he just spoke about, right? Men who were raised in this society where they do feel as though they need to speak and act in a certain manner. And more often than not, particularly if you're online, right? If you're on YouTube or Twitter, and you'll see the responses that you do get whenever you make an argument, in disagreement with someone online. Particularly some of these men that grew up in a feminized society, the immediate response will be to insult your appearance, right? Never to provide a counter argument. It's the feminine response that I can't compete directly or physically, so the only alternative really is just to try an emotional attack, right? And so they'll respond by saying something about your appearance or whatever the case might be. It's usually a very emotional attack that really has no bearing on the conversation whatsoever. And then they'll block you because, again, women are risk averse. They avoid conflict. And so when you see the men behaving in this manner, you can quickly recognize that these were men that were raised in a very feminized society, and these are not people that really should be in charge of anything, because they will respond in the same way that women typically would, and that's not usually the best approach.
Watch Obama and Trudeau and Newsom. When they cross their legs, it's a full chick. And they're signaling, they're presenting. They're going, I have chick dick. So it's a thing. It's happening. It's going to happen. And it will fuck up our society, because if something like COVID comes around, their plan is
you
nobody
don't
leaves
get
their
the
house,
appropriate
shut all the
response to
schools.
something like that.
I'm done here.
Again,
That's
risk
not
averse.
How do we work? How do we deal with the danger? Dealing with the danger,
Just pretend it's not happening.
Shut down. Barbara Ferrer, the health whatever crazy witch who ran this town, her plan was just shut it down. Rochelle Walensky, CDC, just nothing. Just shut it all down. And by the way, lie if you have to keep it shut down. So there is a gynofascism that's sort of coming. And it was a lot of years of like, well, if we just had women in charge, we wouldn't have wars, we wouldn't have crime, we'd have a better society. People would notice.
And this is such a disingenuous argument, right? When we're in charge, we wouldn't have this or that, ignoring all the accomplishments that men have contributed to society. This technological marvel that more often than not, they will be on their phones, designed, created, the resources that built it, mined by men. They're using the very devices, tools, and technology to complain, while ignoring the fact that men got us to this point in society where they can live this comfort and luxurious lifestyle. And his argument there about the men presenting themselves sort of reminded me of this. I believe it was Oxford University. Charlie Kirk was doing a debate with a young man. I think, infamously at this point, I think he was supposed to be school president or something to that effect there. And he was, the debate itself wasn't what sort of pissed me off. It was what he wore to the debate. Right? Here you are at one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, where over, decades, brilliant men have sat and debated. And he shows up in his pajamas to have that debate with Charlie Kirk. And that's what upset me the most about that video. I know people, respond and possibly say it's just clothing, so why does that matter? But it says a lot about your frame of mind. You know, if you're somebody who's obese or fat, it tells me that you lack restraint and control and self-control. If you dress like a slouch, it tells me that your frame of mind is disorganized and disconnected just alike. And so I could immediately tell just by his appearance that this is how he presents himself, that this is a representation of how he wants himself to be perceived, but it's also most likely how his arguments would present themselves as well, which effectively fell apart during the debate against Charlie. Because it was, again, and a very emotional argument. These were all emotional arguments that he made during the debate. But for him to present himself for that debate in that manner tells me that someone decided to prioritize his comfort, what was more comfortable for him to be in, rather than the contents of or his capacity to have the debate in the first place. So that ties back into what Adam is mentioning here about, you know, the men who are groomed within this fascist society and how they present themselves. And I do think we do need to look out for these men and call them out when we do see them and how they behave. We have to begin correcting this behavior.
Not. Los Angeles is basically run by women and is run into the ground. And there's a problem. There's going to continue to be a problem.
Yeah,
and
there will.
We'll see it growing. You'll see more articles on it. There'll be more tests on it, and it'll be less, oh, Adam is just spouting off because he's a misogynist. No, it's a mindset.
That word
a
has
female
lost
mindset,
all
a
meaning
male
at this
mindset,
point.
and it's skewing toward the female, and our society's going to suffer.
So there was a lady who wrote a viral article about this called Helen Andrews.
Yes.
I take it you read it.
I did, because everyone sent it to me,
Right.
because I went, this is what you've been saying for 20 years, and we're here. We're going here. And you go, oh, Adam, you're such a douche, you know, knuckle dragging misogynist. No, women are writing articles on this. There is a difference between men and women, and there's a balance, and it's a good balance. It's a husband and a wife and a child and a home. When you
Correct.
skew it too far the other direction, the feminine direction, there's going to be consequences. That's going to be our future.
All right. Thank you, Adam. That was, you know, that was a good discussion. As I said, it's one that we've been avoiding trying to have, but it is going to be unavoidable as things continue to decline. But one thing I do think we need to do is to reclaim the idea that masculinity, or even the patriarchy, is something that should be dismissed or spoken about as though it's it's a bad thing, right? There's nothing wrong with masculinity. There's nothing wrong with the patriarchy. The patriarchy is what has created the most prosperous society in all of human existence, albeit flawed, but flaws and all. This is a society that men largely built. And secondly, you mentioned Helen Andrews, who I've seen a few videos on, and I caution going in the direction that we should be relying on these women to provide, you know, guidance as to what society ought to look like, right? Because from the interviews that I have seen with Helen, and I've seen this happen more and more frequently, where the Conservative Party now appears to be voiced by women. There's nothing wrong with women sharing their opinions on a matter, but we do need to keep in mind that, and judging from Helen's interviews alone, when she is asked what her prescription is for, you know, the damage that feminism has been doing, her response is typically that we should sort of remove the thumb from the young men that have been oppressed, right? But then she goes on to say that she would not try to limit the women in any way, or the freedoms that women and privileges that women have been given over the years, right? Privileges that they've been provided without any expectation to provide anything for them, right? So she maintains that women should still be in the workplace, still chase their careers if they see fit, all of which does not align with conservative views. So we have to be careful of the women now presenting themselves as conservative, who are in effect just liberal women, who want the freedoms and privileges that men provide to them, while calling themselves conservative. I think, again, she makes some valid arguments, but I don't believe there is such a thing as a conservative woman who is interested in politics, because to be interested in politics means your intention is to subvert your husband's vote to some extent, right? Or have power over him if it is that you are going to be in politics or speaking or trying to direct men or instruct men. So I don't believe you can call yourself a conservative woman and hold those views. So that's um my opinion broadly on what I've heard from her so far. For the video itself, again, Adam had made a lot of valid points, many of which we've discussed here on the channel before. And for again, as I'm sure I'll get a lot of pushback, I'm sure he has as well for his opinion here. But I simply ask people, in the decades that have passed since women's liberation, what exactly is it that women have produced that has, to any extent, really pushed mankind forward? That's a simple question that I like to ask whenever that is the response, because the reality is, by every metric that we look at, um, it isn't there's no net positive impact for women's liberation or the female vote. There's no net benefit there. You've discussed literacy and academia before, and how that is on a downward trend because the classroom has become largely feminized. Trust in science has largely gone down because we've now adopted this idea that, at least in biology, that men and women can change sex, and so that has become feminized itself. It's now just about how one feels, less about the science and what is provable and objective truth. We can look at law enforcement, where we've added women. Adam mentioned, the fire fighters who fail to meet their obligations in the fires that destroyed California, parts of California, and a lot of that rests with the people who were in charge, who, if you do your research, were prioritizing DEI initiatives to get more women into the fire department. Some of them were trying to eliminate the use of the word fireman, because they felt it was sexist, so it should be changed to fire person. These are the things that they were prioritizing, rather than being prepared for disasters that were potentially, coming. We can look at crime, what women have largely voted for, which is soft on crime policies. And we've seen the outcome there. Black Lives Matter. This is a movement that was started by a Black woman. It's ironic because Black men are, largely the ones who are, the recipients of police brutality, right? So why is it that the women are the ones who are trying to usher in these broad movements that seem to have a moving agenda? Defund the police. It's the very same thing, led by women. So there isn't a single point in society as it is where women have been added, where we are seeing a net positive on society as a whole. There is none. Well, I'll leave you with this, right? This was a article that I came across. And it was an interview that Nikola Tesla did in 1924 with the Galveston Daily News, where he was asked why he was never married, right? And this was his response. I had always thought of woman as possessing those delicate qualities of mind and soul that made her, in her respects, far superior to man. I had put her on a lofty pedestal, figuratively speaking, and ranked her in certain important attributes considerably higher than a man. I worshipped at the feet of the creature I had raised to this height, and like every true worshipper, I felt myself unworthy of the object of my worship. But all this was in the past. Now the soft-voiced gentlewoman of my reverent worship has all but vanished. In her place has come the woman who thinks that her chief success in life lies on making herself as much as possible like man in dress, voice, and actions in sports and achievements of every kind. The world has experienced many tragedies, but to my mind, the greatest tragedy of all is the present economic condition wherein women strive against men and in many cases actually succeed in usurping their places in the professional and in industry. This growing tendency of women to overshadow the masculine is a sign of a deteriorating civilization. What I found most interesting about this, if you are familiar with Tesla, he in many ways could be considered or would have been considered a feminist prior to this interview in 1924. Many of the discussions he's had on the subject prior, he praised what women had accomplished and what they could possibly accomplish if they were given more freedoms and liberation. So it's interesting to see as the years went by and he became older and if you look at his past, where I believe he was the youngest of five children, right? Two sons and three daughters. His brother died when he was 5 years old, I believe. um his father was a priest, which largely meant that while his father was away, he was raised by his mother and three sisters. And I note that because it's something that you see often in society today as the courts, prioritize custody to the mother, and the men are raised in these environments, very feminine environments. And Tesla found himself in the same situation here, where he was raised largely in a feminine household, and he was taught that women were these mythological, in the way he speaks about them, these mythological creatures of virtue. And so as he got older and became more experienced and had involvements with these women, he came to the realization that these are more or less opportunists, right? And in a world where, as he said, there are many tragedies, but this is the greatest tragedy of all, because this social experiment that we've been on is leading us to complete and utter societal collapse. The realities are that without men leading society, that is where societies go to die. We're seeing this happening in a few places. The UK, chief among them as it is now, are electing more and more female representatives. And you are seeing the problems that is creating: immigration, crime, again, the declining education and academia. And this is something that will continue as we allow it. I would I would encourage men not to, not to hold this off until this realization, until, like Tesla, we're at in our last moments coming to that conclusion that we need to do something about this. I recall there was following the Netflix Adolescence series, there was a push for a mandatory study for young boys to be taught how to treat young girls. And my rage at that wasn't the policy itself, it was that there weren't any men coming out in the defense of these young boys. That was the thing that upset me the most about that news. I believe men have allowed themselves to, or allow others to convince them that they are powerless, and it's one of the reasons why I reject this notion, this rhetoric that is constantly being pushed, that of men going their own way. I do not accept it. I reject it, and the reason why I do it's because we have a responsibility, if not to ourselves, to our ancestors before us who left a legacy for us to carry on. We do have a responsibility, and if not for their legacy, then do it for self-preservation. There are ongoing discussions about incarceration, I believe in the UK, and while the prison population is, I believe, somewhere between 90 to 95% men, there are discussions about how unfair the remaining 5% women are being treated, and how we can go about making their experience more pleasant, or potentially serving their remaining sentence on the outside, right? The victims that these women are. And so this idea of men going their own way, it doesn't work, because again, if you are not writing the rules, you're not setting the laws, you're not leading society, someone will do it for you, and they will make you an unwilling participant, and you will suffer for it. I know this isn't it's not the most pleasant thing to hear, but I think we have spent far too long treating men as though they're something to be discarded, or convincing them that they are somehow powerless, until we need them, right? When there's a war, if you look at the recruitments that are happening, the recruitment ads and so on, they're all men that they're asking to join, to go to war, to fight and die. Germany just announced that they have a labor shortage, which I found quite hilarious, because for decades the West has been pushing this narrative that women can do everything that men can do. And if there's a shortage of labor, why aren't we utilizing the women that we've been propping up for decades? They will consistently share data to suggest that women are graduating at higher numbers than men. Then where's the result? What are these women producing? And if they are producing, why is there a labor shortage? Let's put them to work. But the reality is they can't. And I hold the men partly responsible for this, because again, you do need to step up, and accept what your responsibilities are. This is not something that's going to come very easy. It's not. But your choice is very limited. The choice is very limited. We can either sit back and watch everything that our forefathers have created be destroyed, and allow ourselves to suffer and wallow in pity while it's destroyed, or we can step up. And I do honestly believe there are a lot of women who are looking for that, who need your guidance, who need you to step up and lead them. The feminism is a part of the problem, but there's also the feminized nature that have been pushed onto men for the last 10, 20 years, even before, really. And that is something that you need to overcome. All right. I know this was a bit of a heavy one, but as I've said before numerous times, the purpose of this channel is for us to have some uncomfortable discussions about uncomfortable truths that we've been ignoring for far too long. All right, guys, I will leave it there. Thanks very much for stopping by, and I'll see you for the next one.